When we talk about the future of work and we talk about what would happen if we don't move on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I don't honestly think that there is a future that's possible.
Studies have shown that more diverse teams tend to perform better, and many companies have made commitments to hiring a more diverse workforce. Yet creating inclusive work cultures that are truly equitable and free of bias remains a formidable challenge for companies, especially since some of the biggest obstacles are the very employees they are trying to change.
One of the challenges in this space is that people do have really strong feelings about what they should do and what's right, but the strategies that organizations have used pretty much universally are not effective. They're ineffective and sometimes make things worse.
So many of us have incredible intentions but terrible actions. And unless you can get your intention and your action to align, then your intention is in vain.
But there may be actions that companies and their employees can take that can mean change is finally starting to happen.
If business would step in and do this work, I think it would change society outside of the walls of business. And yes, it is disruptive. Technology was disruptive. Think about the companies that said, we don't really want to touch technology. They're not here anymore. But from the disruption comes change.
So there's a very strong link between companies who are strong at diversity, equity, and inclusion and increased organizational performance.
This is Dr. David Rock. He's the CEO and co-founder of the Neuro Leadership Institute, a consultancy company that advises organizations on management strategies based on science and evidence-based practices.
The most kind of salient way to understand this is that we all see the world very, very differently. And when you get a homogeneous team or a team that's all basically the same, they actually make more cognitive errors. They don't see errors that other people have made, and they're far less creative and far less innovative than a diverse team.
While these diverse groups may be more efficient, creative, and faster at finding and solving problems, they often feel like they are being less efficient and less confident in their work, partly due to a phenomenon called cognitive elaboration.
Which is a long word for saying you're going to think harder. The teams are thinking harder, thinking is generally aversive, and so we feel more confident and comfortable in teams that are more homogeneous, where people basically agree with us all the time. And it turns out that feels good, but the team is nowhere near as successful.
If companies want to see the positive effects of a diverse and inclusive workforce, they need to find ways to mitigate that naturally occurring friction. Essentially, they need to have their employees be comfortable being uncomfortable.
In business, we go to work, we do our jobs, and we leave. And we are so weary of pushing against the grain with a colleague, with a coworker, with an employer, et cetera, with an employee. And I think if we truly want to grow and get to know each other better, we do have to embrace some of that uncomfortable dialogue for the sake of growth.
This is former NFL linebacker and Fox Sports analyst Emmanuel Acho. And in 2020, he launched a YouTube series all about getting uncomfortable.
Welcome to another episode of Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. When was the last time you sat down just to have a conversation with a group of Black people, Garrett?
I can be honest with you, I don't know that I've ever had a conversation with a group of Black people.
I created Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man out of an overflow of my heart. After the murder of George Floyd, I realized I had to do something.
The series would go on to amass over 17 million views, inspire 2 books, and most recently, Emmanuel launched a podcast with Accenture North America CEO Jimmy Etheridge.
So many CEOs, executives at companies, they want to serve those under them or those with them, but they think they're doing what's best. But unless you ask them what is best, you will be sitting here spinning your wheels and actually not serving the person at all. Primary example, Jimmy and I recently spoke to a woman who was hearing disabled, and we started that conversation on that episode. I used words like that she was different, modified, and all these other fanciful words. But the first question I asked, hey, I'm going to start with this. Disabled. Is that wrong to say or not? And she actually told me she cringed when I said different. She said because she's not different, she is disabled, and like she doesn't find any weakness in that, but she actually finds strength in that. If I don't start with what is a very uncomfortable question, I'm sitting here thinking I'm being polite to try to be kind, and in all honesty, she's cringing on the inside. And that's what so many of us do in the workplace. Well, this is what I'm going to do to make sure I help these black men out. This is what I'm going to do to help out these black women. And so my advice is talk to the people in whom you are trying to serve. Talk to the people in whom you are trying to honor. I had great intentions. My intentions were amazing by trying to use a word that I perceived to be more kind than disabled. My actions, terrible.
In the last decade or so, more businesses have promised to make diversity a major priority. Tech giants like Apple, Google, and Facebook have committed to sharing their internal diversity numbers and annual reports. And while there's been an increase in the overall percentage of employees of color at these companies, for some groups, only minimal progress has been made. When it comes to Black or Latinx employees, their percentage in the last 6 years has only been raised 1 to 3%. While hiring is only step one, retaining and growing diversity is a major focus as well, and something that companies have also struggled with.
Just having bodies in the building doesn't get you anywhere. You have to be able to leverage that diversity, and that means you need systems, you need metrics, you need accountability.
This is Janet Stovall, a veteran of the corporate communications world and a senior client strategist for the Neuro Leadership Institute.
At NLI, we talk about priorities, habits, and systems. So the first thing you have to do is you have to make this a priority. And it has to be a priority like any other business priority that a company decides that it wants to pursue. Then you have to look at the habits that are in place to make people either live up to those priorities or not. And so once you prioritize, you look at the habits that are getting in the way of that priority, and then you build a system to make sure that you can change those habits.
But according to NLI research, some of the most common strategies that companies turn to in order to create inclusion can often have the opposite effect. One example is in the area of unconscious bias training.
It feels really intuitive to mandate, like bias education. Bias is clearly a problem. It seems perfectly logical to say, well, look, everyone should really go through bias training. There's very good evidence that does nothing or makes things worse. I mean, you might get a program that gets a small amount of results, but on average, requiring people to do awareness-building bias training is not going to help very much.
In 2016, researchers who studied 30 years of data from over 800 companies wrote in the Harvard Business Review that the positive effects of diversity training rarely last beyond a day or two, and a number of studies suggest that it can activate bias or spark a backlash.
Now, bias is everywhere because at the end of the day, everybody is born with bias. The problem is when bias gets into business decisions, we sometimes make suboptimal decisions.
And we actually can't see the vast majority of our own biases, no matter how much we want to or how much we know about them. But what we realized is you could do something about bias in teams.
Their strategy takes over 150 forms of bias and groups them into 5 broad categories. Then, instead of asking individuals to self-police their own actions, companies can create systems to encourage teams to get into the habit of identifying biases as they happen.
What we found is when you teach that to people relatively quickly, people start to see these biases as they happen, and relatively quickly they're able to label bias in a process or in a decision, and then work out what to do to address it. And our studies are ongoing, of course, in this space, but we're seeing about 78% of people who learn this framework start to use it weekly, at least 1 to 3 times a week.
It doesn't get us anywhere pointing the finger. What we have to be able to do instead of giving people labels is we have to be able to label behaviors. If we can label behaviors and then agree on a common language for those behaviors, we can talk about what people do separate from what they are. So labeling people racist doesn't help in the business workplace. It just doesn't help at all. But coming up with things that help you change the behavior that might be racist behavior, that's what changes things.
One of the most important things to do with each and every individual is what we call find common ground. And this is a habit of creating in-group with people and really bringing each of you into the same group, in a sense. Or in the brain, it's both of you being in this circle that we all draw around ourselves and being on that same team. And so the habit is in every interaction, whether you're an employee or a manager or leader, in every interaction, you're really finding common ground with that person, ideally creating shared goals. And this creates a really strong sense of inclusion.
I heard it said one time, I can't change hearts, but I can change laws. Well, I'd like to paraphrase that and say, I can't change what you think, but I can certainly change what you do. And as long as I change what you do, I'll end up getting the results that I want.
Improving workplace diversity and inclusion isn't just about building one set of habits or eliminating a certain behavior. And it is likely to be uncomfortable. But if the future of work can truly leverage diverse and inclusive cultures, it can have effects beyond just the company's bottom line.
I truly believe that the business workplace is the only place that some people ever come into contact with anybody who's different from them. We can spend our lives around people who are no different from us outside of work all we want. But if we go to work, and if you have an organization that decides it is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it is committed enough that it is going to have priorities, habits, and systems in place to make that grow and be what it needs to be, you have a choice. If you work in that environment, you're either going to get on with it or you're not. And so I think that if business is the one entity that could actually change this, because no place else has that reach, no place else has that context, no place else has the power, the money, and the resources to change things than the commercial world. And so if we step into this and do this work, I think it'll change society.